Hi, Cliff Goldstein here. Welcome to Contending for the Faith. This is part of a series I'm doing called Faith in Science, and we look at issues in faith and science. How do we, as people of faith, relate to some of the issues that science has raised? Now, as I've said in earlier shows, for most cases, there is no problem. In fact, I could say for myself that science has in many, many ways affirmed my faith. Now, there are cases, important cases, in which the latest teachings of science do seem to completely contradict even the simplest and most broadest reading of the Bible. Thus, the question is, how should we then, as people of faith, intelligently respond when things like this happen? Now, I'm not going to stand up here and say that I've got the definitive answer. I certainly don't. But at the same time, too, I have read in this and studied this a lot, and I'd like to present some background information and just some ideas of looking at this that could help people who at times face this conflict make intelligent choices when presented with some of these challenges. I like to help them do what the Apostle Peter said when he said, "But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and be ready always to give an answer to every man that asks you a reason of the hope that is in you with meekness and fear." Now, again, as I said, in most cases, there's really not a problem with science and faith, but sometimes there is, and science and the challenges of science can be very daunting. I mean, science is a very powerful form of knowledge. It has opened to us vast new vistas of knowledge and reality that we never could have known without the advent of science. Okay? But now notice what I just said to you. I said science is a powerful form of knowledge. But what is knowledge? You know, I'm going to lightly touch on this point and perhaps come back to it in another program. But when you use the word knowledge, what are you implying? What must exist for knowledge to exist? Imagine for a moment, imagine that our universe was once the way, well, a lot of science tells us. Imagine that we lived in a godless, lifeless universe, okay? Not only no God, not only no intelligent form at all, nothing, no consciousness, just dead rocks in a lifeless cosmos with no creator at all. This is basically what science tells us how our universe started out. Now, imagine this kind of a universe. In this universe, could knowledge exist? Think about this for a moment. In a godless, consciousless universe, with nothing existing that can think, how can there be knowledge? Can there be? Of course not. Okay, how could? There might be dead rocks, there might be space, there might be photons and stars, there might be all this stuff, but no knowledge. Knowledge, the very concept of knowledge itself, demands consciousness. It demands a mind to have that knowledge. I mean, knowledge without a mind is as impossible as is thought without a mind. For knowledge is a form of thought, and you can't have a thought without a mind, right? Think about it, okay? Anyway, for knowledge to exist, minds need to exist. Thus, for human knowledge, when we as humans, when we talk about knowledge, we're talking about human knowledge. For human knowledge to exist, human minds, our minds, have to exist. Because our knowledge, anything we know, anything that we call knowledge, this exists in our minds. And that would include, well, even our knowledge of science, right? Science is a form of knowledge. Knowledge needs minds. Human minds means human science. I mean, it means human science means human minds. But I think there's one thing probably everybody, I don't think anybody's going to debate me on this, but I think there's one thing we could all agree on when it comes to human knowledge, knowledge that we have in our brains. And that is one thing. It is always subjective, right? I mean, is not subjectivity wired into us? We are exceedingly subjective beings, greatly limited in what we can know by an almost innumerable number of factors. Thus, anything we know, or anything that we think we know, anything, in fact, that maybe that we are even absolutely positive about, I mean, we still know it only through the subjective portals and filters of our minds. We could be 100% right, such as often in the case of formal logic. Our conclusions must absolutely follow from our premises, but still, the whole foundation of all human knowledge, no matter how correct it might be, still remains hopelessly encased, expressed, and understood through a subjective perspective that it is simply impossible for us, any human beings, to escape. What this means then is that all our knowledge, including, don't forget this because we're often given a different idea, all our knowledge, including our scientific knowledge, comes with a certain amount of subjectivity built right into it, and we cannot, it's impossible for us to escape it. Okay? Of course, science, and I said science as well, which is why sometimes, you ever wonder why science sometimes could be so contradictory? I mean, how many times have you heard that such and such an idea is backed up by the latest science? We think, well, it's science. I've said before, someone says it's science, that's it. Who dare challenge it? And that's fine. Something is backed up by the latest science. Except there's one problem. 20 years later, somebody comes out with science, something backed up by science, that completely contradicts what science taught 20 years ago. Only problem is, and then you can come on, somebody comes along 20 years later and says that science is wrong. I mean, if this is science, which has this kind of elite status as a superior form of knowledge, how come we find such conflicting claims? I mean, you know, when science says something to back up, isn't that kind of it? When somebody has, well, science backs this up, who can argue against science? Well, you know, the answer's easy. You know who argues against science? Science argues against science, and a lot of times too. Let me give you a recent example. The Atlantic Weekly, January 5th, 2014, had an article about a best-selling new book telling us, listen to this now, telling us that according to science, we need, as humans, we need to stop eating all grains. All grains. We're not talking just the refined stuff. All grains, whole grains, grains, period. All the bread, all the grains. It's because we are told by science of all sorts of ailments and problems and so on. You know, it's this gluten intolerance thing. Don't eat grains, science says, okay? Okay? But instead, science tells us eat high-fat diets. Lots of meat. We need to eat meat. According to science, you know, because this is hilarious. According to science, we need to eat the way our ancestors ate 100,000 years ago. And I thought it was pretty funny when I told this to my wife, she quipped, how do these science know what people who didn't even exist eat? Okay, but that's another matter. That's another matter entirely in regards to science. But science here tells us that we should eat meat. But science also tells us the opposite, that we shouldn't eat meat. There's a whole host of evidence, scientific evidence, which teaches something radically different than what a whole host of scientific evidence teaches as well. Okay? A whole host of scientific evidence backed up by other science, argues, backed up by science, tells us that plant-based diet is the best diet. Other science say, no, just eat a lot of meat. So how could that, what's going on here? We're talking science now. So science tells us one thing, and science tells us the opposite. And we're not necessarily talking different generations. Science says one thing, and then 50 years later, science comes along and says something else. We're talking about simultaneously. We're talking about science in labs, using what has been called the scientific method, being supposedly objective, rational, methodical, and all these things, and they come up with opposite and contradictory conclusions. How does this happen? I mean, this is science, objective, rational. That's what I want to look at. You know, in the last program we did called Science of Knowledge, and we looked at this fancy term, epistemology. As I said, it's the study of not what we know, but what do we mean when we say we know something. We have different ways of coming to knowledge. I know that 2 + 2 = 4 differently than I know that I have a toothache, okay? And we look to the fact that science is also science is indeed an epistemology, but it's an empiricist epistemology. And what do I mean when I say an empiricist epistemology? What does that mean? This is important. Let's say I say to you, say there's a room over there, and I say to you, there are 10 people in the room. You could say, all right, I'm going to go over and check, okay? And let me go see. So that's a perfectly reasonable way of checking a fact, of getting a truth. This is what we mean by empiricism. You go to the room, you open the door, you look in, and you see, wow, there are 10 people in the room. That is what is known as empiricism. And when you learn things that way, you are using an empiricist epistemology. Now, suppose, though, I said to you, if there are 10 people in the room, then there are 3 more people in the room than there would be if there were only 7 people in the room. Okay? And suppose in response to that, you said, okay, let me go in the room and check and see for myself. Huh? Why would you say that? That would be rather unnecessary, because sheer rationality tells you that 10 is 3 more than 7, so you don't have to go into the room and check. Okay? In the first instance, when I said there are 10 people in the room, you go in, you have to go in the room. You go in the room and you use your senses and you find the answer. You find the truth. In the second, you don't need to do that. You have your rational thought gives you the answer. The first instance is empiricism, okay? It's employing your senses to understand the world. Now, the bottom line is this, as I said before, science is an empiricist epistemology. It's when we use our senses to come to a knowledge about something. And yes, science is at its core a very empirical way of coming to knowledge. Science uses their senses, often aided by very sophisticated instruments, to look at nature. You know, I don't care, from Aristotle, who used to just look around at bugs and plants and creatures in the sea, to astronomers who use the Hubble spacecraft. Science is empirical. It uses sense data to get information from the world. And then, and this is crucial, and we'll have to come back to this at some point, they then have to interpret that data. What does it mean? And then from that, try and devise technologies or whatever they do from it. Now, on one level, you know, this seems all pretty clear, cut and dry. But on another level, this is something which is fraught with all sorts of problems and questions that people have been dealing with for centuries. And quite frankly, amazingly enough, they still haven't come up with any clear-cut answers. In fact, just as a real quick, interesting aside, for something so fruitful as science, for something that works so well as science does, it's amazing how much disparity and disagreement exists in regards to science, what it is, how it works, or what does it even teach us. You know, scientists actually even disagree on what science is. Yes, debate doesn't just exist over the nature of scientific conclusions or why we conclude what we do or what science does. You know, people question even what is science itself. It's often called the demarcation problem. How do you decide what counts for real science as opposed to what they call pseudoscience? Now, my point in all this is I don't want to digress too far on this, is that everything is not as clear, cut, and dry as we think. When we hear the statement, well, it's science, we don't have to kowtow and bend our knee before it and subject all our views to it because it comes with the name science. This is a big myth. This is a very big myth. And it's precisely these kind of questions that I have been wanting to look at in this series, because I don't think we should allow ourselves to be intellectually bullied by anything just because it comes under the imprimatur of science. Now, anyway, the scientific endeavor, as I said, is essentially an empirical one. We use our senses to try to understand the world. Now, it's not just that, though. There's more to it as well. Have you ever thought for a minute about how much math is used in science? Well, there's an awful lot of math. I remember when I was young, I once thought I wanted to be an astronomer. You know, I just sit there and look up at the sky with the telescope and philosophize and muse about what's going on Pluto or Mars or something. But have you ever looked at an astronomy book today? It's almost all math. Or have you ever looked at a physics book? It's almost all math. So now this is quite interesting, because however empirical science is at the core, you know, it does employ math. And you can argue that whatever math is, it's really not empirical. I mean, what does a 2 look like? Have you ever seen a 2, just a plain old disembodied 2 floating out there? I mean, you know, not 2 fish, not 2 fingers. I mean, just a disembodied number 2. What does it look like? What form, what shape does it have? And 2 is easy. What is a -6? I mean, does a -6 have any kind of existence out there? And what do these things even look like? Whatever they are, they're certainly not empirical. And yet math is a kind of language used to explain what supposedly is going on in the real world, the empirical world, the world of science. Things are just out there, and we really try to understand them, and we use things like math to describe them, because that's really all math can do is describe. Mathematical equations never explain anything. They just describe. But anyway, even using math, science is empirical. We use our senses to try to figure out what's going on, to describe it, to explain it. Anyway, now, how accurate is all these things that we do? How well do they work? And then you run into another problem, too. Think of all the social influences and forces that impact science. Think of all the science that was done funded by the tobacco companies on the question about whether tobacco is really bad for you. No question. Science is an empiricist epistemology, and as such, it comes with all sorts of problems and loopholes and things that today have still not been resolved. You know, think about it on one level. Think about it on one level, how deceitful our senses can be. You know, we've already talked about this in other programs, but let me give you an example for a minute. Let's go back to the room with 10 people, okay? I said someone says there's 10 people in the room. You walk in and you see and you use your senses and you count whatever and you count 10 people. How could there be any question? Can't you be as sure of that as you were of the statement, well, if there are 10 people in the room, then there's 3 more people in the room than there were if there were just 7 people in the room? Can't you be just as certain? Isn't, in this case, an empiricist epistemology working just as well as rationalism? Well, suppose you're in the room and you count 10 people. But suppose someone was hiding underneath the table and you didn't see them. Or suppose they were in the rafters over your head. Or suppose your definition of the room or somebody else's definition of the room didn't include the concept of the closet and there were 2 people in the closet. Or suppose you were an American who lived in the time of the Confederacy when slaves were considered only 2/3 a person and there were 4 slaves in the room. How many people would be in the room? Suddenly, it's not so clear, cut, and dry. But then you say, but doesn't science create all these fancy instruments to help us understand the world around us? Of course it does. And these instruments can be very, very helpful. But I don't think that's a move somebody who wants to defend an empiricist epistemology would want to make a move on defending an empiricist epistemology about giving us an accurate view of the world. I'm not so sure that's a move you want to make. Okay? Someone once expressed it like this. Dr. So-and-so has a theory that the world is made of vectors. So Dr. So-and-so builds a device looking for vectors. And what do you know? Dr. So-and-so with the device finds vectors. Thus, Dr. So-and-so has got he's got empirical proof that the world is made of vectors, okay? Now, to be fair, science doesn't always work this way, and there have been examples where they have found things that they really didn't expect. Anyway, the point of all this, the point is simply this. You can't build, even scientific instruments can't be built without the scientist already building his or her presuppositions into it already. Now, the scientist might have some brilliant and well-founded reasons for those presuppositions, and they might even be right, and so on, and the machines are accurate, but they might be dead wrong too, and they might give us a totally incorrect view of the world as well. And then when you have your device, how do you know it's working well? Or there's some unknown factors going on? I once read a book where they said maybe the color of the scientist's lab coat could influence the outcome of the experiment. You know, I think for a minute of that giant particle accelerator they've got in Switzerland, CERN. This massive thing, and they don't like you calling them atom smashers, but they shoot these subatomic particles around this thing at super high speeds, and they smash into each other, and they crack, and they blow up, and then they study whatever comes out. And they say they were looking for the Higgs boson or something for it. Now, when they say they smash atoms and look for particles that come out, what do they mean? I mean, they smash them, and then somebody takes a tweezer and picks up a Higgs boson and says, oh, look, here's the Higgs boson. Okay? No, they go, I don't know exactly what they mean, but they have detectors that they spent $650 million on the detector alone. Okay? Now, I don't know all that went into all this. But when you spend $650 million on a detector, you're building in a lot of assumptions, a lot of presuppositions into this. I can't even begin to imagine how fantastically complicated all this would be. okay? And you are working with a lot of data being interpreted by a lot of people, being studied and analyzed and so forth. And that's fine. I imagine they know what they're doing. But let's not forget what they are doing. Let's not forget that there's a whole lot more presuppositions, a whole lot more subjectivity built into this than I think we, looking at it on the surface, would tend to think. In fact, there's a whole lot more subjectivity in all our scientific endeavors than most people would think. That's just the peculiar nature of human knowledge in general, and empirical knowledge in particular. And this subjectivity also includes, in a great way, human science. As I said, science is, as we said, an empirical attempt to understand the world. And precisely because it's that, it's filled with all sorts of subjectivity that, no doubt, gets in the way to some degree or another. Now, does this mean that science is always wrong? Of course not, okay? But it should help us be very, very wary of the idea that science is always right. And if science says something, and then we as Christians just have to flat out accept it, even if it contradicts our beliefs, sorry, folks. But that doesn't work that way. It shouldn't work that way, okay? Because unfortunately for many Christians, it does. We have, as believers, very good reasons for our belief. And we need to remember that science is a human project. And thus, a priori, we can argue that it's always flawed. And I think about the knowledge of science in contrast to a different kind of knowledge. This comes in Job 28. Where does wisdom come from? Where does understanding dwell? God understands the way to it, for he alone knows where it dwells. For he views the ends of the earth and sees everything under the heavens. When he established the force of the wind and measured out the waters, when he made a decree for the rain and path for the thunderstorm, then he looked at wisdom and appraised it. He confirmed it and he tested it. And he said to man, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to shun evil is understanding. How in the world could science ever give us that kind of knowledge?